Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the RMS Titanic, but in a slightly different way, a different fashion. What if the Titanic never sank? It's an interesting question because there's a whole bunch of ramifications that go with it. First off, the story of the Titanic has been so romanticized, and the story itself, its history, has been so, how can I put it, adulterated, that we really don't even know the real story. And perhaps one of the most important stories of the RMS Titanic is it was not a wonder ship. People weren't gasping when they saw it. People weren't going crazy about it. It wasn't the greatest thing of the century. It wasn't the unsinkable Titanic. It was a ship that was one of several in the Olympic class. You see, when the Titanic sailed, the most famous ship in the world at that time, actually there would be two at that time. One would be the Mauretania, which was the fastest ship in the world, had the blue ribbon, and the other would be the RMS Olympic, which was the largest ship in the world, well, until the Titanic. But the thing is that the Olympic was the Titanic's sister. See, the Olympic came out before the Titanic. So all the bells, all the whistles, all the hollering, all the press coverage, all the great photographs are all of the Olympic. In fact, here is a massive picture of the RMS Olympic, if I can do it this way so you can see. There you are. In fact, if you didn't know better, you'd say that's the Titanic. Well, it's not. It is the Olympic, which was the first of this class of ships. Now let me explain what this class of ships were. Now, of course, you had the Mauretania and the Lusitania. Both were contenders for the blue ribbon, and in fact stole it back and forth from each other for a couple of years until the Mauretania took it finally. They were fast greyhounds, and they were nice looking inside, but they weren't extremely spacious, and they were more inclined towards speed than total comfort. What the design was with the Olympic class, which was much longer, over 100 feet longer than the Mauretania or the Lusitania, and another 10 feet wider, and nowhere near as highly powered, so they moved slower, therefore they were more comfortable. And that was the whole idea behind the Olympic class, was comfort and a moderate speed. Whereas the Lusitania and the Mauretania were crossing the Atlantic regularly at about 24 knots in average, the Olympic class would do it at about 21 knots in average. Both sets of ships could go faster than that. Probably with the Olympic class they could get up to 24 knots. Maybe if pushing it really hard, they might get up to 25. With the Cunarders, the Lusitania and Mauretania, if pushed, those could go close to about 30 knots. And there are times when the Mauretania, especially in old age, was flying along at amazing speeds. But I'm getting away from the main topic of the story here, which is what would happen if the Titanic didn't sink. Well, you see, the Titanic, as I said, was part of the Olympic class. The first was the Olympic. And I have to tell you, from the onset, from its launching to its fitting out to its final epic maiden voyage, the world could not get enough of the Olympic. it became the greatest ship in the world. It was called the Ship of Dreams, the Millionaire's Special, the practically unsinkable Olympic. By the way, the term practically unsinkable came from the shipbuilder and used by Scientific American as well, and it was used to describe many ships. The Mauretania, the Lusitania were listed as being practically unsinkable. The Adriatic, the Olympic, the Titanic, and that was the end of that because no one dared say such a thing again. It was an overused term that was used in totally the wrong way after the Titanic sank. Now, this is a photograph of the Titanic, actually. See if I can do this so you can see it better so you don't have reflection here. There, that's the Titanic. And it's signed by survivor of the Titanic. But it's identical pretty much to the Olympic, except for a few things. It had an enclosed promenade, had some extra cabins, which all added up to a couple of 100 tons more weight, therefore it was the larger of the two ships. In other ways, basically almost no difference at all. Now, had the Titanic not sunk, had the Titanic made its maiden voyage, everything would have been wonderful for the White Star Line. Now, here's some of the unusual things I got to tell you. As I said, when the Olympic sailed, the press was incredible. What do you do with a second Olympic? No one was really interested in hearing about the Titanic. You know, I went through newspapers from January to April of 1912 trying to find information on that maiden voyage. And it's interesting to note there are some stories, yes. But if you look at what was going on with the Olympic the prior year, for every story on the Titanic, there were 20 on the Olympic. Because nobody wanted to hear about another Olympic. And that's what they considered the Titanic. It was just another Olympic. Of course, everything changed when it sank. The entire story would change because had the Titanic not sunk, you would have had the Olympic, and then the Titanic, and then the third, which was going to be called Gigantic, which would have a 3-ship system, which would keep an express train-like system working. Now, the express train wasn't as fast as the Mauretania and Lusitania, which were able to do it every week, going back and forth. In the case of the White Star Line, since these ships were bigger and slower, they needed 3. And had the 3-ship system gone, it would have been a magnificent system. You would have had the Titanic join the Olympic and the Gigantic, had they survived, and become as obscure and unknown as the Olympic is to us today. You see, had the Titanic not sunk, so many things would have been very, very different. But when it sank, it changed everything forever. First off, the White Star Line was devastated. Secondly, the loss of life was catastrophic. It caused a great deal of change in laws. Now, let's get past some of the silly nonsense we hear all the time. The Titanic was unsinkable, therefore, it didn't have many lifeboats. That's utter bullshit. Do you realize that the Titanic had more lifeboats than the Mauretania or the Lusitania? Why? Was it because the Lusitania and the Mauretania were unsinkable? No. That was standard operating procedure in those days. 16 lifeboats were considered enough for any ocean liner because no one could conceive of a ship sinking. Think about it. When had ships, major ocean liners that were subdivided in compartments, like all of these ships in the 20th century, in the beginning of it, going all the way back, it goes to the Oceanic, at the same kind of system, basically, like the Titanic. So they looked at it this way, that it would take a very long time for these ships to sink, and also the lifeboats would be looked upon as instruments to ferry people back and forth between ships. That is why the law was set up as it was. It was antiquated. It was out of date totally. But every ship that was British, or American-owned that was British, followed the tenets of that law. The Titanic went above that. It carried 4 collapsibles, making it 20 lifeboats. So please, when you talk about the Titanic, they didn't have less lifeboats because of that. It wasn't because it was unsinkable. It was because that was the law at the time. Now, 3 o'clock. Had the Titanic not sunk, things probably would have stayed the same till World War I. And then you would have had the 3 White Star liners. Probably one of them would have been sunk during World War I, and the other 2 would have lasted until the 1930s, or maybe one might have made it into World War II, like the Aquitania, and became a troop ship. But you know something? If indeed the Titanic had not sunk, I would not be talking to you today about the Titanic. Because how many people today know about the Olympic? Nobody. They don't realize that the Olympic-class liners were cookie-cutter ships, basically. And that the Olympic was the first of the class. The Olympic is what was the true star, not the Titanic. The only reason the Titanic is famous is because it sank. And we have some bizarre romantic notions about the Titanic, and we hardly give the Olympic a thought. The Olympic was the same thing. The Olympic was the ship of dreams. And the Olympic was fully booked on its maiden voyage. The Titanic was only half booked, fortunately, because nobody was really excited, because it was another Olympic. It's an interesting thing when you think about this stuff. We don't talk about it too much. I always find it fascinating, especially the last of the sisters, who nobody even knows anything about. That was a ship that eventually, instead of being called Gigantic, was called Britannic. And it had to be totally redesigned to deal with the disaster of the Titanic. And of course they needed more lifeboats, of course, and so they came up with these incredibly bizarre-looking davits. And also they added much to the ship, therefore it was quite a bit larger than her 2 previous sisters. And by the time it was completed, World War I had started, and it immediately was drafted into service. They hadn't even installed the woodwork inside the ship. They just basically sent her out as a hospital ship. Within a few months, she hit a mine and sank. Rather quickly, actually. And fortunately, she wasn't filled with patients at the time. She was on her way to pick them up. But those are the 3 ships. How many of you know who the Olympic is? Who was the Olympic? What was the Olympic? People think, when you hear Olympics, they think of the sports. But at one time, the greatest ship in the world was the Olympic, and very much overshadowed her newer sister called the Titanic. Today, it's very much reversed. Everyone knows the Titanic, and nobody has the faintest idea, except for a few people, that the Titanic was one of those situations where no one could care, because it was just another Olympic. Thank you.